Just want to welcome everybody to a special event that we are calling Beyond the Ballot, and why we are here. We are here because of what happened on November 5th, and in what's been happening ever since November 5th. And so there was just, everyone had questions. There was questions all over the place. Everybody was just trying to figure out what was going on and why it was going on, and questions this, and then getting into some deeper questions on the political process. I didn't have the answers, and so I said, well, we know a few people who did have a few answers. And so we have brought together two panelists today who hopefully can help us out in terms of figuring out why we are here and what's going on with some of the variety of things that are happening in the political arena. And we have some questions that we're going to ask them, and we have some questions that if you have questions that you want to ask, we can have questions from the floor as well. But we're going to make sure that we try to clear everything out, and we know our panelists don't have all the answers.
We don't even have most of them.
Okay. They have two answers tonight, and so, but we we'll work on getting through this process. And so I've told our panelists I'm going to have them introduce themselves because I have their bio, but they know themselves better than I do. So we're going to start with Dr. Chryl Laird, and if you can just give us an idea of where all this started and how you got to where you are.
Okay, sure. So I am Dr. Chryl Laird. I'm an associate professor of government and politics at the University of Maryland, College Park. I got my Ph.D. at Ohio State University, as well as my master's degree from there as well. My bachelor's degree is in African American Studies and Government, Politics, and Political Science, actually from the University of Maryland, College Park, so it's my alma mater. I have been studying Black politics, American politics, for a pretty long time. I would say this would make it almost 20 years since I started when I was in college studying it. I do work on American politics, looking at Black political behavior as well as Black partisanship. I recently wrote a book in 2020 called Steadfast Democrats: How Social Forces Shape Black America, along with my co-author Ishmael White, who is a professor of political science at Princeton University. So I've been doing this for a while. We can give some insight into what's been going on, so hopefully I can give you some responses, you guys can ask questions, and it can be a really good event.
Yeah. Hi, y'all. I'm Dr. Julian Wamble. I am an assistant professor at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Like Chryl, I study Black politics, looking at Black political behavior and vote choice. I haven't been doing this as long as Chryl, but I've got a couple of hours clocked in. I just wrote a book titled, what's it called? We Choose You: How Black Voters Choose Candidates to Support. Yeah, that's how new it is. I don't have the title ready to go yet. That just came out not too long ago. And yeah, it's important for you all to know Chryl is my best friend. So we're going to have a good time. This is as much and as downtrodden as this political situation may have us. Like we're going to be laughing. Yes. We're going to be having a good time. Yes. You are invited to do the same.
Yes. My child might also join us.
Yes.
She is currently in the stroller.
Simone is going to have some feedback for us.
She might make an appearance.
So while there is a level of formality insofar that we are at a table and you are there, we are suspending some of that as well for the sake of this. And so just know we're going to have a good time because this is all we do all the time. So that's an important preface for us to have. Oh, what else? I got my PhD from the University of Maryland, College Park, my undergraduate degree from Drew University in Madison, New Jersey, and my master's degree from the Ohio State in Columbus, Ohio, all in political science. So there's my resume.
And you went to elementary school where?
At Fort Washington Forest, right down the street.
And for a second, you went to middle school.
No, I went to middle school at Eugene Burroughs.
At Eugene Burroughs, yes. That's a special time in our lives. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So as we get to, I want to start with a question like, how did we get here? We know in November, right? And there were great expectations in some circles in terms of what might be happening as we moved into place, things were looking good for a while, and then all of a sudden they looked another way. And so if you can give us an idea of just what happened.
Do you want to begin?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to preface this by saying that the task before Kamala Harris was nearly impossible. What was asked of her to take on a full running train, going full speed, top speed actually, in June, and bring it safely into the station while there was another train going right next to it that didn't have the change in captains, is a meaningful thing for us to remember. We also have to remember where we are in the United States on a number of different dimensions. And so that when we think about what happened, the reality is that what happened was a series of events that, if she had pulled it off, would have been tantamount to doing the impossible. And so what happened was, we had all of this momentum and all of these people and a lot of money and all these things that suggested to us a very specific direction. But then we were met with the reality of what it is to be in the United States of America, particularly thinking through what it means to have a Black woman as the chief running this place, and what that means for a lot of people. And I think that something that my students often bring to bear in our conversations is the reality that there are a lot of people in a lot of places that we know nothing about. And what tends to happen is that we live in the spaces, our bubbles, and believe, because we're all having conversations with people who believe what we believe, that we're all on the same page. And then what happens is we forget the people who live in other places and spaces that we couldn't even point to on a map, who have different beliefs, and they show up to vote too. And that's, if I had to kind of sum it up, that's what happened.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think another factor to think about in what happened is to recognize that Donald Trump continued to run for the presidency during the Biden administration, right? So there's something to be said about someone who not only he wasn't an incumbent, but he had previously served in the role, and that he also had maintained space in the media. And this is something they talk about like in Hollywood a bit, like all news is good news, right? Like all media is kind of good media. So even though the discussions around Trump that were going on were court cases and felony charges and various things that were happening, and I think there was an assumption that this would be a deterrent for people to not support him. Again, to Julian's point, if we're thinking about people who may be in spaces that maybe you are not privy to or you are not engaged with, there's an assumption that we're thinking that everybody is going to feel the same way about what we are witnessing. And we do research on behavior where we look at things from anything from like, how do people read a news article? Do they read it the same way? Do people look at a video and see the same thing? And so while there may be those who would look at what was happening with Trump and think, see, this is a demonstration of a particular type of person with a particular type of character that I don't think I would want to support, there were a lot of people who were like, I kind of don't care that any of that is going on. In fact, what that has actually done is continue to keep his name relevant to me, right? He clearly seems to be somebody salient, somebody important, and I'm going to get my support behind them. So then what you have in that type of circumstances, there is name recognition for both of those candidates, right? Donald Trump has previously been in the office and Harris is a sitting vice president. But you also have a mobilization effort that also needs to occur. And if people weren't aware that this past election was one of our lower turnout elections, so relative particularly to 2020, which had a lot of high turnout, we were in the middle of COVID, a lot of people did mail-in ballots, there was a whole effort to get people to get out and vote and an initiative to do so. I think because of also the emotions and the psychological space that people were in at the time. In this election, there wasn't as much energy towards even just participating from either side of the aisle, but now that's going to be a matter then of which side of the aisle is going to be able to get more people out to do what they need to do and get more people out to do what they need to do for their candidate in key states across the country.
And what else is true is that, Kamala Harris also had to contend with the fact that she was running, hold on, I'm going to bring this down a little bit, okay, that she was running she was the incumbent VP turned vice presidential candidate. So Donald Trump had a record that he could run on that was his. Harris had to run on Biden's, but then also shift a little bit. So when we think about the kinds of campaigns that they were having to run and what needed to be done and undone, Trump didn't have as much work to do as Harris did in this regard, right? Because she had to basically say, here's what you were promised from, let's say, January to June, and now here's what we're going to do from June to November, but also I have to give my own voice to this. Like, I also have to tell you that, who I am as a person, because a lot of people, most of us don't know anything about the VPs. And so she had to reintroduce herself to the country as well. So the hill that she had to climb was significantly steeper than Donald Trump's was. And so I think when we consider, what information people would have needed to want to vote for her, absent all of the other racial and gendered things that were going on, the reality is that there was a lot of stuff that she had to do that Donald Trump simply just did not. He just had to stay relevant for long enough to get to November and not be in jail. And
even if he was.
And even if he was. And even if he was.
I cannot rule that out.
No. And I think as we kind of continue in this conversation, I think what's important to remember, because I think a lot of us are asking, how is that even possible? And the big thing is, when the founding fathers founded this nation, Donald Trump was not at the forefront of their minds, right? Like, he wasn't the person. They never thought that it would ever get to a place where you would have someone like him. Well, for two reasons. One, many of them were like him, but that's a different story for a different day. But the second story is that they never conceptualized the idea that they would have someone like Donald Trump, which means that all of the safeguards that you and I are running around like, why didn't they have this, or why wasn't this, or how could it be that he could be in court and still be running for president? How could it be that he could be someone who is potentially in jail and still run for president, right? The reality is that the founding fathers never even conceptualized the thought of that. And at no point in American history has there been a situation that looks like this that would have prompted Congress to draft any sort of legislation to do this. And what it takes to try and get that kind of legislation to exist requires a lot more bipartisanship than we have seen in a long time. And so the reality is that, as we think about why and how and who and where and what, a lot of this has its foundation in the fact that the Constitution, for all of the things that it has done, doesn't really give us a lot of instructions about what to do in a situation like this. And that's the document on which we have built our entire political system.
So now, after November, President Trump is elected, he gets into office in January, and now we're seeing all of these executive orders. My boy, his arm should be hurting as many of these things he signed. So we want to get an idea, if you can explain to us, because a lot of us are like, what is this? What does it really mean? What is an executive order? And what kind of power does it have? What does this all mean with all these orders that he's signing?
Okay, so we can give kind of first a formal definition around executive orders. We wanted to make sure people have a perspective on what it is. So one of the formal definitions of how presidential executive orders is defined is a directive issued by the president that has the force of law. It tells federal agencies how to carry out existing laws or policies. Executive orders do not create new laws, and that's an important thing to think about. Only Congress can do that. Think of them as instructions from the boss, the president, to the employee, federal agencies, on how to do their jobs. Now, EOs, which is short for executive orders, can often be drafted for different reasons. The thing that makes them key about why it's important to think about them, they're not law, is that they can be rescinded and are often rescinded in a following administration that may not agree with the executive order that was put forward before, right? So it does not hold the same legitimacy or the same status as a piece of law that is determined by Congress that then becomes a law that's on the books, or even precedent that gets established about the interpretation of the law that comes from the Supreme Court, right? The executive office, even though what we are witnessing is very, I would say, anomalous in a lot of ways for modern history, right? Like it's kind of an aberrant situation. The executive office is actually supposed to have fairly diminished power, which is why they can't really create laws. And it's also why even their behavior is up for review when it comes to things like the constitutionality of what they're doing. And we'll talk about that more a bit later. But executive orders, I mean, it's interesting because one of the executive orders that I teach about when I talk about EOs in my class is Japanese internment camps. That was an executive order, right? And it was done in that moment with the fear that Japanese people were a threat to the United States in the wake of like Pearl Harbor. And so they decided that we were going to take a particular action to respond to that. It was temporary, right? Even though, you know, there were internment camps and people did get interned, but it did not last, right, for an extended period of time. It did not become a law that we were just interning Japanese people, you know, in perpetuity or something, right? So EOs can get created, they can get rescinded, and they typically come out of the presidential office.
And what else is important for us to remember is that a lot of these EOs are occupying the space of the executive branch. So we're talking, you know, DOJ, we're talking about the departments, right? We've heard all of the letters, all the DO, whatever, DOE, DOJ. So it's in that space that we're then seeing these EOs really taking place and kind of taking root, because that is where the president constitutionally has given jurisdiction, right? Like he runs the executive branch. So all of the departments that fall under his purview are where he gets to assert his power in a meaningful way. What we're witnessing right now is, again, when we think about how these things were defined and by whom historically, right? What we're seeing right now is the pushing of the boundaries of these EOs. How far can they go? And if we've learned anything about President Trump, it's that he is willing to push it as far as he's allowed. And that's what he's doing currently. And what we're also seeing, right, is the backlash of that. We're seeing justices at the federal level saying, you can't do that. You know, so we're seeing people are kind of being yo-yoed around, like, do you have a job? Do you not have a job? And part of that, right, is the checks and balances system at work, where we see the court saying, you thought you could do that, and you cannot, and so now you have to go undo what you've done. And then there are also questions about that will be kind of litigated over time about the constitutionality and the legality of some of these things as they continue to unfold. Because all Trump is, he's just throwing, you know, spaghetti at a wall and seeing what is allowed to stick. And so in that way, it's hard for us to really understand the bounds of these things, because we're in uncharted territory. Because most presidents don't, they all want to push, but he is just throwing everything and just seeing what he's allowed to get away with. And that, I think, also complicates the way that we understand these executive orders.
I don't think so. To my knowledge, there isn't a limit.
No.
There have been records of who's seen as like writing the most. I think Trump has openly said that he wants to be the person who's written the most. Just because I think that's something he would like to have in the history books. But I also think as every executive order goes and is getting tested, I think he is of the mind, right, that I can just continue to write these, right? Like one thing with the executive orders that people are finding out about them is, and what is typical of an executive order, I mean, it's not a piece of legislation, so it's not a very detailed document, right? Even when legislation is passed, it typically goes through bureaucratic channels where the actual application of, let's say they say, we're gonna allocate $100 million to funding after-school programs for kids, like in a piece of legislation. What that actually looks like is a process, right? It has to go through bureaucrats, it has to go through various people, it has to trickle down. Okay, states are gonna get certain allocations, it has to go through this whole process. And that all gets kind of determined even after the bill is signed into law. In this case, the EOs are even shorter than a bill. Like, the bills are lengthier than what is going on with the EOs. The EOs are a couple pages, like they're not very detailed, but it is giving directives to the people who are heading up these positions in the cabinet. and who basically are the head people over all of those different departments to make determinations about how they then go about executing what he's saying. So it's interesting because some of it is people are responding to what they see. Some of the behavior that we're witnessing are people trying to preemptively respond to something that isn't necessarily law. They're just responding because he has put out the EO.
And we also have to remember that he's in the first. And so every president throws every EO that they ever thought of during this time because the goal is to appear productive.
Correct.
And so what is happening, right, is that his desire for productivity, which in this case, in this moment, is government efficiency, however it is that he's defining that, right? And so he's doing all of these things, and all of these things are making headlines, which to him and his people suggest, oh, things are getting done. What then is also happening, not on the news and behind the scenes, is that people are also then getting their jobs back. Because in the meetings that we can read about, it doesn't work the way that he thinks it is. But his goal is not stability, it's just looking like he's doing something, right? And so a lot of the EOs that we're seeing, it looks like it's a lot more is happening than is actually happening, and the legality of all of this is still being adjudicated in courts across the country, like as we speak. And so it wouldn't surprise me if as time proceeds, a lot of the things that he's put forth then gets repealed, as we're already seeing, and I would expect a continuation of that because, again, what he is allowed to control as the executive is pretty specific, but he is really pushing against it, and so it's basically a battle between him and the court system, not just the Supreme Court system, but like the entire judiciary, broadly construed, the federal courts, who are saying, you are not allowed to do that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question is one of the questions. First, I want to welcome everybody who's online with us today, who are on the YouTube channel. If you have questions, you can go to the chat. If you send in a question on the chat, then we will get to you, and we will answer that question as well. But one of the questions is, does the president's power have any boundaries? And I know it does, but it seems, with all the crazy that he's doing, it seems that he's the only one in charge and no one else is doing anything. So who are the ones that can hold the president, put some boundaries around what he can and cannot do?
Okay, so there's like a couple boundaries that are supposed to exist.
Supposed to, I want to be very clear.
If we were picking up an American politics textbook and I was teaching Intro to American Politics, this is what it would say at the basic level, right? Is that there is a separation of powers, right, within the federal government system. You have the executive branch, which has the White House, plus all of the cabinet that are the leaders over various departments, right? Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, Department of Homeland Security, and such, okay? And that office has bounds on it, and the checks on the behavior of the president comes from the other two bodies that comprise the federal government. So you have Congress, which has the power of the purse, which is the budget, and they also create law. They also can impeach, for instance, the president. So if you remember, there were impeachment proceedings around Trump, going back a little further, 90s, if you remember, that also happened with Clinton, right? There were impeachment proceedings. In that situation of an impeachment, for instance, you would have to have an impeachment coming from both the House of Representatives and from the Senate for the president to be impeached. In both cases, they only had it from one of the bodies of the two chambers of Congress. So Congress is supposed to serve a check on power because they're supposed to be able to control the money. They're supposed to be able to create law. And if they had concern about the president, they are also supposed to be in the position to be able to remove them if there was an issue. The other body is going to be like the Supreme Court, right? So the Supreme Court is also the justices. We have 9 justices that sit on the Supreme Court. They are also supposed to serve as a check to make sure that whatever the president is doing is constitutional. So if you recall, for instance, when we had the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare became part of our medical offerings, there was a court case that went to the the Supreme Court to see if it was constitutionally okay for there to be essentially a requirement that people have like health care. Like they're calling it a tax and saying, can he do that? Can he create this tax on people to have health care, right? At the end of the day, Obamacare ended up kind of staying alive because the decision was, no, it's fine that people are being asked to do this. It's not in violation of anything. So you have also the Supreme Court do that. And then the fourth would be like the people, right? Like, so we vote and voting, and then those votes, there's the popular vote, and then there's the Electoral College. And as you've seen in some previous elections, and that often there's instances where the Electoral College and the popular vote don't match. And so the Electoral College often is what is used as the voice of the people. And so that is also supposed to be a check on the president, because in theory you can vote a president out.
And so what's important about all of this breakdown is that, again, in an idealized world, all of these things are meant to create a space where individuals, there's enough bipartisanship or people on each side and civility across those sides that people can understand and do what is like for the greater good of the country. We are not experiencing that particular dynamic right now as it pertains to the way that both parties are operating, right? And so at every single one of these levels, right, at the congressional level, we're seeing a lot of individuals who are Trump supporters before they are representatives, right? And then we're seeing individuals also like this in the Senate. We're also seeing in the Supreme Court, right, that there are justices who are seemingly just willing to do whatever it is that Trump has put forth. And then there are some who are willing to push back, even those who he placed into office. Now, the Supreme Court is meant to be an impartial judicial body. We are learning that that is less and less the case, right? And then the people, right, are also individuals who are operating from a space of understanding Trump and the Republican Party as a very specific thing. And so at every single one of these levels, right, these boundaries do exist. However, they only work if you enforce them. And when there are, at every single one of these levels, people who are not interested in the enforcement of them, then we can see why they are not operating the way that we would expect them to operate.
I would think, too, to the point that Julian was bringing up earlier about the Constitution, when they were formulating that document, this type of partisan situation that we have wasn't even in their minds. Also, the people who created our Constitution are a bunch of like 20 and 30-year-old men who
were rich and owned slaves. So we're not looking at people who were the most moral. They were smart, whip smart, but when you think, and what else is important is like the Constitution itself was really for them.
Yes.
So that when we, and it matters because when we ask ourselves, why doesn't this exist in the Constitution? We have to remember who it was written for.
Correct.
And by, exactly. And they really wrote it for landed, white, wealthy men in that order.
Yes. Which is why we have so many amendments. Which is, we don't actually have a ton of amendments, but more. It's why we have amendments happen, right? Why we had to add amendments to the Constitution, like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, right? Around the idea of like we have to free enslaved people, except in the case of punishment, and equal protection, and the right to vote for like African Americans, right? And African American men, even in that instance. So then another thing has to come later. There's the 19th Amendment for women to be able to vote. So these additions are in part because the original document itself was not encompassing of the populace in the way, and not nearly aware, there's no forward thinking that the populace would look in the way that it looks today at the time that it's being designed. Which then, gets into a debate about, there are various people who view the Constitution as something where we need to be trying to do what they call like the literal interpretation, or like the originalists, right? They're the original interpretation of the Constitution, and we need to look at it as such. And then there are other people who fall into the camp of it's a living document that actually should be more evolving So for instance, we don't have like privacy protections explicitly in the Constitution, but we live in a digital landscape where all of our information and our data is susceptible to interference or potential compromise. But there's nothing in the Constitution like necessarily to protect us from that. So there's conversation about what that should look like.
So another question is, what should Congress be doing to stop the president from overstepping his boundaries?
Well,
there was some stuff recently.
Well, and then, so again, a lot of this is contingent on having a congressional body that is actually interested in constraining the powers of the president.
Correct.
So if you don't have a Congress that is interested in doing that, well then you're not going to get a Congress that does it, right? And so in this regard, and what else is important is that the Republicans have the House, they got the Senate, and so, right, and the executive. So they're running all three.
Yes.
And while the margins are not massive, they still got it. And what this then means is that when you, and what is also important, again, is that it's not even that the Republicans have it, but that the vocal majority and the individuals, the Speaker of the House, these are individuals who are very much aligned with Trump's vision. So that any sort of accountability isn't going to come from them, but they're the ones with the actual power to put forth legislation, to approve things. And so this is the problem, right? Is that in theory, Congress should be able to do something, but it's all stacked. And it's not only just stacked with people who are his party, but it's people who are like his, for lack of a better term, followers.
They're his followers. And I would say too, right, this is what we call unified government. Mm-hmm. So they have terms like divided government and unified government. So unified government means that essentially the Congress and the executive are of the same parties, right? And in this case, you have the executive is a Republican, the House majority is Republican, and the Senate majority is Republican, right? Now, if the Republican Party was the Republican Party of, 20, even 30 years ago, right, it would look different, right? Because the Republican Party had a lot more diversity in terms of the types of Republicans. So you had they talked about even in the Democratic Party, right? We had blue dog Democrats. These were seen as conservative Democrats. You had rhinos. They would often call them Republican in name only. A Colin Powell kind of wouldn't exist well in this Republican Party, even though he himself is a Republican, right? Even Ronald Reagan probably wouldn't exist well in this current Republican Party because he raised taxes every year he was in office for 8 years, right? So he wouldn't be very good in this Republican Party. So the Republican Party has taken on a different identity. I think the era of Trump will be beyond even his own time in office because he has altered the party significantly. But also his presence as the leader, I think not only do you have people who are his followers, but I think there are people who are concerned about the sanctions, essentially what he will do to them if they are not compliant to what he wants. So what I've been hearing, at least in reading in the news, has been there is a lot of dissension actually behind the scenes, but no one is going to make that publicly known. And so it's interesting because when I wrote the book with Ishmael White and Steadfast Democrats, this is something we actually talk about in the last chapter of the book, because we talk about how in the Black community, we often operate in a politic that is very much trying to leverage our power as a numerical, in terms of where we are in the population size, we are a small number, but we're powerful because we act as a collective, right? And we hold people accountable in the group who seem to be threatening the group's interest overall. Right, so if we see the Democrats as the people who are going to be best suited in the system that we have to do this for us, they're not the ideal, but it's what we have, then Black people get behind that and they will, we will wag a finger and call out people who don't. The Republicans kind of have a similar thing going on, right, which is they are somewhat making it clear that people will be quote unquote punished. What does a punishment look like? They are threatening to primary somebody against you. Primary meaning we will run a candidate against you in your district, in your state, that is loyal to us, and we will fund their campaign, right? And that gets into like soft money in politics, right? So when people and corporations and various things now can have that kind of influence and money, then the ability to fund, that doesn't mean that person's gonna win, but they can make it really hard for you. They can make it really hard for you, right? So those threats and concerns about disloyalty can also maintain a collective behavior and response that looks like what we've been seeing.
So I know that there are questions. I got the questions.
Someone.
I'm working this. And so, Brother Sam has a question right here. So if you could wait, hold on, got a mic coming so that people who are online will be able to hear the question. And so if you have a question, please raise your hand. I will see you. I will acknowledge you. Stand up and give us your name and your question.
My name is Sam Penny. And since we were talking about the congressional process of this, I know the midterms are a little ways away.
Yes.
But are there any early indicators of how?
Okay, so the question is about the midterms, if people didn't hear, and what we should be thinking about are indications that we have at the moment about what that might look like. Okay. It's a little early to know exactly what's going on. It is not uncommon, like the pattern, I think the trend in history has typically been, even in a case where someone comes in and they come in a favor that Trump has had of a unified government of Republicans in Congress, both chambers and in the executive as himself, that typically the midterms is a time when the other party gains, right? So they could lose seats, the Republican Party, and Democrats could gain seats in the midterm, right? And that could be through electoral losses. Funny story, it could be someone changing parties, right? Because potentially the aftermath of what has gone on now in this first 100 days and the subsequent effects thereafter could result in a response from people at the district levels when it comes to the representatives, when it comes to the Senate as well, that decide that they don't want to stand beside these elected officials. And they could still be people who maybe like Trump, but maybe they're upset with their congressional rep or they're upset with their senator, right? And feeling like they are not responding to their concerns.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, so he's going to the town hall meetings and the responses we're seeing of people.
Oh, people are mad.
People are mad.
And part of it, right, is that, people don't realize how much the government pays for a lot of things in their lives. And so what happens is they say, because Republican is the party of smaller government, and Trump is, part of government efficiency is to shrink the government and to send power back to the states. Most of the people live in states that have been in the red for as long as these people have been alive. But they don't know that. They have absolutely no idea. They don't realize that their, whatever is being subsidized by the government. They have no sense. And so when you start to shrink the government, which is what they want in theory, what they realize very quickly is that their bank accounts don't look the same. That they actually are dealing with a lot more governmental financial intervention than they believed. And so what we're seeing at a lot of these town halls, particularly in agricultural states, where individuals had no idea that their farms that they have been running that belonged to their great-great-great-great-grandfather and has just been, running for them, was being subsidized by the government. And this is particularly true for white farmers because black farmers were not getting those subsidies. And so what we're also seeing is black farmers being like, well, welcome to the club, right? And so when we think about what this means, so I think Cheryl's point about it being early matters because people, you gotta hit people where it hurts, right before the election. Because institutional memory is short. And all it takes is, a good tax return and you've forgotten everything, right? And so what this means, though, I mean, and so if the trend that he is on continues, and the rollback of these subsidies and all of these programs persist, we might expect to see some backlash that might be outsized to the regular kind of flipping of parties that we normally see during these moments in the midterm elections. But it has to persist, because once people start figuring out how to make this work for themselves, they will forget who did it. And we're already talking about people who are very uninterested on average in kind of critically thinking about what it is that he's doing and what it means for them. And a lot of people who voted for him were happy that he gave them, you know, the stimulus check. So money talks. And as long as people's pocketbooks are hurt, we will probably, it feels safe to say, we will see some movement. What that movement looks like is unclear as of right now. But I think what we're seeing in a lot of these town halls is people having to realize that all of the programs you thought were just affecting black and brown people are actually affecting you, and you just didn't know because you thought your subsidies were special, and they're not.
There was an article this morning, actually, I think from 2 days ago, actually, that was from Yahoo News, and it was saying in there that behind the scenes, there are Republican pundits and strategists who are trying to talk to the executive offices, talk to the leadership in there, because they're like, DEI is not just black people in the ghetto. Like Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, our people get those too.
In bigger numbers, because they make up more of the population.
Right, so people are going to get upset about the loss, like, and if you're not familiar with some of this, I'm talking about like areas like Midwest particularly, rural parts of the country, areas where coal was really big and has declined, industrial decline has been significant, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. You have whole towns where people are very much reliant on federal dollars, but they themselves see themselves as deserving of those dollars, more so than other people receiving them. And there's a politic around that, in the way in which, how they come to that conclusion, but nonetheless they see it, they believe that. So when then the president makes the statements, I'm rolling back DEI, it is very possible that those people do not think that that includes them.
Oh, it is probable that they don't think, and that they don't realize who the biggest beneficiaries of all of those programs are, and it's people who are their neighbors. It's them, it's their cousin Bill, it's all those people, right? But and so what Trump is so effective at doing is tapping into the implicit and explicit racism that exists in the country, so that when people hear diversity, they think not me. When really they have been the biggest recipients of all of these things, because we are dealing with people who may be lacking in education or first generation. That's DEI. White women are the biggest beneficiaries of DEI affirmative action, particularly in the workplace, right? And so, but
even
none
in the college space,
in college.
Rural students.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely.
Accepted at schools is considered DEI.
And no, but they don't couch it in those terms, right? So we don't talk about, when the face of affirmative action, the face of DEI, are faces that look like the ones that are in this room right now, and we are not the biggest recipients of those things. But when the characterization is one that suggests that we are, people start saying, yeah, well, get rid of it. Get rid of those programs. It doesn't. What does that mean for me? And then a new month hits, and the check's not checking the way that it used to. And now all of a sudden you're realizing that you've been part of DEI your whole life, and you just didn't know because no one told you.
Good afternoon. I'm Carmelita Walker, and I just want to say I'm a product and a very active participant in the movement, Black History movement back in the 60s. I mean, I had the Bush, power to the people, march, move on. But I thought I heard you say that we were premature in all of the outcries and the marches that are taking place right now. Did I hear you say that?
No.
Oh. People should be doing that.
Yes.
Yes. People should be louder, even, probably, in this moment.
Okay, I just want to make sure I heard you correctly.
Yes.
The only way the civil rights movement was able to come to fruition is because of the outcry and the television featuring it, because a lot of people do only listen to Fox News, so they don't hear what's really going on until they see these protests in their communities.
Correct.
So that's what I wanted to make sure I
Correct.
heard.
absolutely.
It is a way to correct, especially in the climate we're in, something like misinformation, because you're noting to news and news agencies that provide information. There's a lot of misinformation that's happening, and I think that would be a contributing factor to also why the election had some of the things that went on. And so it matters, in real life observing of unrest, of people upset. And I think it will also matter who it is.
Yes.
So it matters that it is rural white Nebraskans or right, rural white North Carolinians. Black people too, but it really matters that it's white individuals who are demonstrating some anguish and irritation with what's going on.
Hi, I'm Sean Shorter. I just want to say first, thank you guys for being here, Chryl. Can you hear me? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But when you were speaking of white people not realizing that they were on welfare, because we have always been put in the forefront of being a poster child for welfare and for affirmative action or such. So I was reading about one of Trump's people who found out when she got back to Alabama, I think she's the head of the college in Alabama, that after she was up in saying, yeah, this is right, clapping at him at the joint assembly, she got back home and realized, we on welfare. You know, we're not getting DEI. It was amazing to see, like, they really thought, but like you said, when you have the complexion for the protection, it comes off different, how you got it, but when we get it, they want to show us with the babies and this, and that's considered what welfare is. But they've been getting aid from the government long before we were ever in.
Well, I mean, if you think about, and this is one of the big things that I think about often, which is, one of the biggest aids from the government that a lot of these, particularly southern states got was enslavement. And when we think about things like the Electoral College, which is a problem that lots of people have, right? Lots of questions about, part of the reason why it exists the way that it does and benefits the states that it does is because when you are using bodies as a way to, one, build the nation, but also build your population, it then completely moves everything around. And so what is true for a lot of southern states now is that they know, part of getting rid of DEI is not talking about, American history, but the idea of enslaved individuals played such a big part in the economy, so that now most of these states that have been in the red for a long time, who have been getting these subsidies, are now getting subsidized because the thing that made them their money, they don't have it anymore, and it's been gone for a very long time. And when you didn't have industry because you were agricultural, that's what was happening in the South, and your main workers were free. That's easy then, because you got free labor, and you were getting governmental assistance insofar that you were getting more political power because you were using the bodies of those individuals even though you weren't paying them, right? Then when all that goes away, you lose all this money. And so then the government has to step in to make sure that you can stay afloat. But when we are not talking about that, because the South won, this is the narrative, right? That when you say that the South won, we are not now talking about what has to be done because y'all really lost. And so what that means is that the government is giving you and funding all of these things, and it's not part of the narrative anymore. And so when you get, so now all of a sudden, the programs that were really built for you, for them, for the individuals who were living in these places, and you never thought about it because that was never the language, and because you're creating an image that suggests that you are not the recipients. It's how you end up in a place now where people are screaming and yelling at their elected representatives because they are like, how did this happen? And it's like, this has been happening for hundreds of years. And you just didn't know because you didn't want to know, and they didn't want you to know. And I think that's important because so often in our own conversations with our friends and family, we're like, how the heck could you not? They don't want to know. And they don't, and it doesn't benefit the government if they do know. So then the narrative is put on people who don't look like them. And as a people, we have to know what they know and what we know. And so as a result, we have a higher level of awareness of these things that they do not, and that is purposeful.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is LaVon Monroe. And my question is, DEI, that term, has it been camouflaged under affirmative action? Because I wasn't even aware of what DEI was until Vice President Harris ran, and then the term DEI, and I was like, what on earth is that? But my question is, a lot of people, myself included, had no clue as to what DEI was until she started running.
Yes, so I would give the Republicans a very, even all the way back to like the Southern strategy. I mean, even before then, but they are really good at naming things and making things stick.
So good at branding.
It's so good at branding. This, if I had a critique for the Democrats, I'm like, a lot of what Obama worked with is that he had good branding, right? Like, he had ambition, he had goals, but he had good branding. It was hope.
Hope and change.
These easy things, right? And with DEI, right? So DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? It is typically something that is used in institutions as a means to try to actively encourage and try to actively, proactively allow for a set of people to be evaluated for opportunities where everybody should be considered. And so we should do due diligence to try to do that. So in the university setting, for instance, I have friends who've worked in admissions, right? A school wants to do DEI in admissions. The assumption that people are operating is, we are letting in quote unquote unqualified students into schools. That is not what that is, right? That's why the branding matters. In this case, what it means, we want a pool of applicants who apply to our school, and we want to consider as many potential students who could be here. Well, we need to make sure that we don't just recruit go make an effort to get applications from the kids who know of us. Maybe we need to go to the places where they don't know about us. So we're going to go to rural communities. We're going to go to Black communities. We're going to go to Native reservations. I worked at Bowdoin College. If you're on a Native reservation, probably in like Nevada or one of these, you're not going to know about Bowdoin College in Maine. I didn't know about Bowdoin College in Maine. I thought it was pronounced Bowdoin when they called me. And so, right, like you just don't know. I didn't even know about that school when I was applying for schools, and I probably could have went to Bowdoin, right? But if you don't have people who are making themselves noticeable to you, right, that is what that is supposed to be, right? It's supposed to, let's make sure the applicant pool is full and flush with people, right? But that also increases the competition in a pool of applicants. And we're talking about a country where in other points in our history, and some would even still say so today, but like at other points in our history, at least there was a hand down on that, right? Which was basically certain people were being privileged no matter what, right? Because we just didn't have efforts like that going on. So it led to a skew in the kinds of people who occupied particular positions and had particular access to opportunities. And an awareness became, maybe we should not do that. For various reasons. One being this seems to be in violation of the efforts of things like civil rights. We also shouldn't do that because if we want to problem solve things well, it actually might be good to have people who come from different perspectives of life in the room to make those types of decisions, right? But the term now, I think in the wake particularly of Black Lives Matter, the efforts that went on, this could go all the way back from like even Ferguson 2014 and forward, right? The term DEI, I think, took on a different name because there was a lot of forward-facing talk in the media, a lot more conversation that I think for people who are not used to having those conversations. They were confronted with the reality that there are people who are saying that they are living a different existence in this country that is not compatible with what I understand this country to be, right? And they were kind of brought into that because of the loss of life of various people who died during fatal incidents of police brutality, and a lot of latitude being given to having those forward-facing conversations. For many people, that was scary, just straight up. It was scary. It was confusing. And not scary like I'm scared of the police, scary in that the version of America that I understand is changing. And I don't like that. It feels like I'm losing power. It feels like I'm losing leverage. It feels like I'm losing opportunities that should be mine, right? Because all opportunities are mine. There are no opportunities that are not mine. Everything should be available to me. And so DEI then gets kind of leverage, taken from spaces of business and the academy, and is now thrown around to basically apply to anybody who's not, I would say, a white man, essentially. The white women are being called DEI, they just don't know it.
That's true. That's true.
They just don't know it. Like, they don't want to believe that to be true. But like, for instance, the efforts to roll back DEI at Arlington Cemetery that just happened, they took away the names of Latino, Black, and women. Women. So that's the 6888 and all them white women who fought in various wars. Them too. They sometimes don't know, but you too are considered the DEI.
And we see this meaningful uptick in kind of diversity initiatives when you have instances like the civil rights movement. So like when we think about what was happening in the corporate world in the 70s and 80s, a lot of black people, particularly black men, were ushered into certain spaces and places in upper echelons of these big time companies because there was a response to the kind of outcrop, right? And that's meaningful because what it suggests is that so then this is kind of it means meaningful kind of a social uplift for many people within the black community, and in a lot of ways, but it all comes in these particular moments of unrest, and then there's a kind of an ebbing and a flowing. And what ends up happening, right, is that, what happens after 2020 is we see all these companies. We remember. We were all at home, so I know we remember because we weren't doing anything else. We remember all of these companies rolling out all of these initiatives to try and really, and the language was diversity and equity. A lot of people got real big raises at their jobs because they became the diversity and equity officer, right? Which was a job that didn't really exist, and what it meant was not clear, but it looked good. But then time marches on, and what happens is that the institutional memory, remember y'all, is short. So now all of a sudden, what it looks like is equality. We did it. We figured it out. We made it happen. And so now people are mad because they're like, well, we did the DEI thing, and so that, and that was very short-lived. And then you get people now who are now using it as, for lack of a better term, like a slur to basically denote underqualified and undeserving.
Yes.
And so then we see the rollback, right? And that's how you end up getting someone saying something about like Kamala Harris being a DEI hire when she is one of the most qualified candidates that we've had. And people will still say these things because it doesn't have to be true. Because again, Republicans are good at branding. So it doesn't have to be true. It just has to be believed. And that is where I think the idea of DEI kind of stands. And now, what's interesting is, we're looking at Target right now, who is suffering financially because of their rollback of DEI, even though they had been at the forefront of really putting forth particularly black businesses in their stores. And so they have been experiencing massive amounts of financial loss because of this. Meanwhile, Costco's thriving, right? Because what people don't recognize also is that, when you remove these things, we're not going to pay you any of our money anymore.
Correct.
And so what is happening is that there are also corporations that are now learning this particular truth. And Target is the first that's really, really, and to the point where the CEO is under a lot of fire from board members because they're like, we didn't know that you were about to do that. Because a massive amount of their money comes from communities of color who go there because they are promoting communities of color. And so that the DEI has like political and also very strong social implications. And what we're witnessing right now, and what we will undoubtedly see, because again, it's an ebb and a flow, is as we get towards the end of Trump's term, it will come back. It'll come back again because it doesn't do, particularly for these businesses, to not have this.
Correct.
It just doesn't, and at the university level, it'll come back.
Yep.
Because it doesn't, because what is true, and particularly for a lot of younger white people, they don't, more often than not, they don't want to be in classrooms with just young white people like themselves. They actually enjoy the idea of hearing, that's why they went to the school. If they wanted to go to those places, there are schools they could have gone to, and they didn't. And so that there is a demand on the part of students to the institutions that they're at, that there needs to be more diversity at the faculty level. That's how Cheryl and I got our jobs. That at the student level, right? Like there is this, and so while we're seeing the rollback and we're seeing it used the way that it's being used in this current moment, it's also important to know that there is this kind of very strong ebb and flow that comes along with it. And that these companies recognize the meaning, but they really don't get it until they get hit in the pocketbooks.
Right. It's probably why Costco is making a massive, financial gain right now.
Oh, absolutely.
Hi, my name is Samuel Carter, and my question is, I believe that pushback on all levels are important against unjust and immoral action, but my concern is what recourse does the judicial branch have when the executive branch defies a court order?
This is a good question. We are probably going to witness what happens. I don't think, from what I've read and been watching, there isn't much precedent of a president defying a court order. And to date, Trump hasn't. So when he was told he had to hire, I think there was something, the NLRB, the black woman who was the head of that, she had to come back to work. And there was like a whole fanfare for her to come back. And she walked in the door. I think it becomes difficult because they are bringing the executive office essentially and its representatives, right? Like Attorney General, like all these different legal officials, they have to come and bring justification for what they're doing. In theory, if they weren't following along, I mean, it would matter of more, the court might make multiple rulings on it. Like I can imagine like there's a first ruling and then maybe another place makes a ruling and there could be more and more pressure for them to comply with it. Then the next would be, okay, I mean, we were just talking about the civil rights movement, right? Like people could just force their way into a compliance, right? So if they say you got your job back, in theory, thousands of people could just show up to work. And then what are you gonna do? Are you not gonna let them work? Are you not gonna pay them their money? Because then that's an additional set of legal action that would be taken on their behalf to basically force those funds to get released, for them to get their jobs back, right, to get their health benefits, to get various things. So I think it's, once the court decision has been made, the actions that then follow, if there is not compliance, then can they be forced into doing it? But it is yet to be tested, but we might see it.
And part of the reason why, again, and I'm going to keep harping on this because it's important, which is that when all of the different branches were set up, they weren't thinking we're going to have because the whole point of the Constitution was like, we don't have a king, right? Like we've created this idea that we will not have a monarch. That's why we fought a war. That's why we got on boats. That's why we did the whole thing. The whole thing, right, was to avoid this particular dynamic. And so, you know, the optimism of the founding fathers meant that, you know, you create a document where you believe everyone has bought in. And what we're dealing with right now is the reality that like everyone isn't buying in, and one of the biggest people who hasn't bought in is running the place, right? And so that is the problem, because there really isn't anything written down to create that level of accountability that he could be censured in some way, because they didn't write the document with the belief that the American people would elect someone who would be willing to do this, because we don't want a king. And it turns out that some people do.
People want to can't go there. So I want to deal with everyone's favorite guy. Elon Musk. I know y'all love Elon Musk. I know y'all just here on that. What the heck is this dude doing? And does he have any power to do it? I mean, what?
Founders of PayPal. So he's been around for a while. In fact, at the time, I think that he was developing PayPal with Peter Thiel, I think he was actually undocumented because he had stayed over his educational visa.
Wow.
So he was here on a school visa, and he overstayed it. So he was actually undocumented because he's South African, right? He's an Afrikaner. And since then, PayPal was a massively successful company, still in operation. And now he is also the head person, I guess, CEO there at Tesla.
I don't think he is
not
anymore.
CEO
No.
anymore.
But he also comes from
He also comes
old
money.
diamond money.
Diamond money.
So he was real rich before he even became richer.
Correct. And in that regard, Trump and him have a shared experience there, right? They both are affluent men who come from affluent men, right? Generations of money, right? And so that is a relationship that has emerged where, in fact, I would say Elon Musk and Donald Trump both have history where they were on the other side of this. Like where they are right now, they were actually more on the left, both of them. And I think they have progressively moved to the right because of several things. One, I think they could rationalize this for their business ventures and financial gains and economics, because honestly, it all comes back down to money at the end of the day. And Elon and him kind of were like this match made.
Not in heaven, but
where I think they both saw their goals and their path towards those goals being something that could come together very well, like they could mesh well, right? I think there has been some slights that people have felt, like at the upper levels in terms of people who have lots of money and or a lot of power. I do remember and recall people saying that Elon Musk, I think, felt a slight from Biden at one point and from some of the Democrats because they weren't really taking as much heed to respond to his request for more government contracts or more government supports for some of his vision of SpaceX and all these other things that he's kind of investing in. And with that sentiment, I think, he felt like there was other opportunities elsewhere, right? So here's Trump, and Trump wants some support, and then Elon acquires Twitter as well.
Yeah, and then he, ultimately paid to get Pennsylvania for Trump, and this matters, obviously. But then we'll fast forward, right? So we get Doge. Because the whole point is we'll remember in 2016 it was all drain the swamp, and then the swamp just got swampier, right? And so now, and again, part of what Trump is effective at is appearing to be effective, and so he establishes the Department of Governmental Efficiency, which is an organization that, because he's done this, and it's relatively unprecedented the way that he's done it. What it is, what it can do, and how it works, we're literally all of us sitting and watching it in real time. Yeah. Because even Congress people are like, what is this? Because normally, depending on the kind of department that's being created, we've all sat and watched, or at least seen the highlights of senatorial confirmations for the individuals who want to be running these, who are being appointed to these particular cabinet positions. But that Elon Musk has not done that, and that's partially because Doge is seen as a kind of secondary department, wherein you don't have to be put up for Senate confirmation, but it is operating as if it's not that, and it's a primary one, right? And so the hard part of answering the question is that we don't know, and when we know, you'll know, because we're all learning it together. Because again, this is one of these moments where we see Trump really pushing against the boundaries of what he's meant to be able to do. And what we also then see, right, is the courts on both sides being like, you can't, what is this? And you can't do that?
The legality of it.
And so there are a lot of questions about how legal this actually is, and what is actually being done, because what we're also hearing and reading, right, is that Musk is giving, we got rid of $4 billion, and they said you need to turn that B to an M,
Right.
because you can't do math, right? And so that we're seeing a lot of errors and misinformation and disinformation being put out, because again, it's about looking effective, not being effective, right? And so and for whom is also not clear. And so in theory, the answer is hard to give, because we don't actually know the bounds of what he can do, because neither does he.
Yes.
And neither does Trump,
No.
because they are just going and going until they can't go anymore, until someone says you gotta stop.
But it would be expected that after Trump, Doge wouldn't exist.
Right.
And Doge may not even exist through the entire Trump presidency.
It's not meant to, right? Because that's part of it, right? Is that it's supposed to be temporary, because the whole point is make the government efficient, and then Doge goes away.
And then Doge goes away.
And so when you couch it in those terms, it means that you don't have to do Senate confirmation, because this is not a department that is going to be here in perpetuity,
Right.
but rather is here for a very specific reason, and once that reason is done, it's done.
Because I think the last department we created in a long-term capacity is the Department of Homeland
Yeah,
Security,
DHS,
which
yeah.
came after 9/11, right? So we get that created, and that has now continued to stay. There's also pushback from people in the more formal cabinets. So the cabinet members, so people who are in these long-term institutions, I heard about, it's funny because I think about the Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, was also somebody who was on The Real World many, many years ago. He was on The Real World with Boston. I remember watching that season as a teenager, and now he's the Transportation Secretary. The world is wild. Nonetheless, there he is. And he got mad at Doge, from what I heard, because he was like, you all are doing cuts to transportation. You all are trying to cut literally people working in the FAA, like the air traffic controllers. And Elon responded, I think, like, really? And he was like, stop. Like, don't do that. Like, that's insane that you would be doing that. Don't do that. And they were like, okay, I guess we should. So there's like a lot of error happening. Like a lot of error. I think not too long ago there was like a thing where they got rid of like a lot of people who managed our nuclear stuff. And we did that by accident. Whoops. Yeah. So I mean, I think it will more than likely go the length of time in which, to the point that Trump starts to feel like it's not doing him any good anymore. Which could come quickly if his approval ratings keep moving in the way that they're moving.
And that's what, and these are the things that he cares about, right?
Yes.
And it is, again, I feel like there are also a lot of people who were working jobs that are federally funded and they did not know. So that when you start pulling federal funds from things, now all of a sudden you realize, oh, I'm a federal worker. Or the company that I work for only exists because it got this amount of money from the federal government. And now, in the name of efficiency, my job has been removed, and I'm taking care of my parents, and I can't afford to have. That's also what we're dealing with, right? And so part of the journey is the realization that so many people are not realizing how much the federal government is actually funding their livelihoods. And people are getting mad at Elon because he's messing with that. And the thing that Trump can't stand is, one, people are attributing all of these decisions that are being made to Elon Musk. Trump can't stand that because it means that he's not getting the credit he believes he deserves, right?
It's like babysitting his son.
Exactly. We should expect Doge. I don't expect for it to last too long, because it simply can't do the thing that it needs to do if it means that we're firing FAA individuals, we are getting rid of all of these employees that we actually need, and the idea of trimming the fat or reducing the bloat of the federal government is, in theory, fine, well, and good, but when you don't know how the government actually works, and you're just going in and taking care of all of these people who are these probationary workers at the bottom, thinking, what is it, last to hire, first to fire, like that mentality, it completely undermines because you don't know why they got hired in the first place.
No.
And yeah,
so
go ahead.
And the retirement component, I think, is something to think about as well, right? So one of the things with efficiency, one has to think about what the term means. In this interpretation of the term, it is cuts. Mm-hmm. There would be many who would argue that efficiency for the federal government actually means that we need to hire, right? That the amount of people that we actually have working in the federal government is deficient to the size of the country and the services that it needs to provide, right? And so that would be, we would be thinking that we would be increasing the number of people who are these early career people, particularly with the idea that a lot of people who do comprise the government and our the workforce, I mean, I think the number is something like a third are people who are going to be retiring or are already at the age of retirement, right? They can retire. And so who is going to replace them? And the decision then to go and do something like what has occurred, which is going after first hired, like last hired, first fired type method, it decreases the likelihood that then when you really do need to fill these positions, because someone has to actually operate these things, you will not find a population of young people who want to do it, right? Like you're convincing them that they should take the risk of the public sector, which was supposed to be not risky comparatively to the private market.
And we also know that people, I'm sorry, this is going to be very short. We also know that like when people go into the federal government, they tend to stay. And so what this also means is that if you start cutting off at the bottom, people who have an understanding of how systems run and who go up the ranks, you're reducing that number. So now you're getting people who at a certain point as time marches on won't know what the heck is going on once they've ascended because they haven't started from the bottom and worked their way up, which completely then undermines the efficiency as well. Please.
I'm Sharon Corner Jackson. This question is for you, Dr. Julian.
Oh.
This concerns, for me, the Kennedy Center. So I understand the artists who are beginning to cancel their performances. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm torn because, as I said, I understand that. Is the better pushback to accept the engagement and then be canceled by them, which then I believe causes more, I don't want to say uproar per se, but it allows people to become more engaged. So I know you are very much involved in the culture.
Yeah, I think that it's a tricky situation to think about because, the Kennedy Center, one, is very strongly federally funded, right? But I think that for the artist, we have to think about the cost of coming. So when we think about Hamilton the musical was going to come and they canceled, it is very expensive to move your actors, your staff, your crew, to build the set, to do all of those things. And so it is beneficial for them to cancel earlier because that is them saving all of this money. And we would expect then for a musical like Hamilton, that's not so woke that they wouldn't have people, they would allow that one to come, right? And I think, and what's true, and I have a friend who works for the Kennedy Center, and a lot of people are removing themselves out of protest. I don't actually think that most of the things that would be set to come would be canceled by Trump. I think on the whole, he's from New York, he enjoys theater, the extent to which it is very specific kinds of performances that he was interested in getting rid of, and that's why he wanted to take over as chairman, which feels ridiculous because he's the president of the United States, but I digress. And so I think that because of that, the preemptive removal of oneself or one's production is meaningful, because I don't think that the alternative would have been that they would not allow you to come. And it also sends a message that, like, we don't need to show up here. I mean, one of the things about living in the DC area is that, and Cheryl and I talk about this all the time, there are so many theaters. Hamilton can go someplace else, right? There are other options available to it in this place that are easier to get to, and a little bit cheaper. And so the idea of it is that this is important because, you know, he can control a lot. He can control who decides to come. He can't control who decides not to come. And that matters because it sends a very particular message about what these individuals are not willing to tolerate. And I think that it's important because we're talking about a person who is not used to accountability. And this is a means of accountability that I think is important. And it's unfortunate because the Kennedy Center, I think, will suffer financially because of this. But, you know, I think that is the byproduct of this. And people still go. I mean, they talked about J.D. Vance and his wife went, and they got booed at the symphony. So people are still going. But I do think that, you know, it's important to recognize on the part of the people calling the shots what people will not allow you to get away with. And so I think that that's what we're seeing here is this is the best form of accountability for the situation that they're in.
You may also be concerned about the brand of their, like Issa Rae was supposed to come, right? She does Insecure, she did Awkward Black Girl on YouTube, she has all these different television shows, and she decided not to come. I think Issa Rae not only she's taking a stand in accountability, but I also think she's like, my consumer is not going to be happy with me continuing to do this. Versus like, you know, W. Kamau Bell, the comedian, and he also had like a show on CNN. He said he's going to do his show, but I don't think he would suffer as much of a cost because I feel like a lot of his work is oriented towards an audience that is not as centered with like Black women, for instance, comprising that, right? And so he felt like he wanted to do it as a stand against power, right? So he sees it differently, like more in line with your thinking as well. So I think it's how people are interpreting
the response, what the response will be.
So we're running out of time. Time is rolling. You can put your hand down and go to it. So I got a question that will probably be the closing question.
You see how? No. Listen, 90 minutes, y'all. Come on. Come on.
We don't have any more time. But based on everything that we've talked about, what would be your advice to our congregation to solidify ourselves politically, financially, and socially? What would help?
This is such a small question.
This is where you got 2 minutes. As you look at churches and who we are, y'all study the Black community, you know the importance of churches. With all this madness going on, everybody, man, if I had a guitar, I'd be singing the blues right now. Everybody's singing the blues about what's going on. Everybody's sad, everybody's upset, everybody's getting so freaked out because every single day Trump gives us something to be freaked out about.
Sure.
What would be your suggestion in terms of what we can do as a collective body to move forward and hopefully move through what we are experiencing right now? Okay. Dr. Julian.
So here's the thing, and this is something I tell myself all the time. If our ancestors can survive slavery, Jim Crow, and any of the other things, Trump is nothing. He is a moment, a blip in history. We are talking centuries of enslavement. No ability to read, we couldn't write, we had access to nothing, and yet we're all here in this space. If we allow that to be the lighthouse on the sea that is this moment, it is just a moment. When you compare 4 years to 300, it's just a moment. That is what is true. And now, that doesn't take away from all of the sentiment and the feeling of watching the news and seeing, you know, all of the madness going on. But it's a moment. And there are things we can do, right? Like what we are learning with Target, our money matters. You know, what else is true? We talked about the midterm elections. On average, turnout for midterm elections is historically low. Every single election, it looks like a really bad roller coaster. Turn out to vote. Get your friends to vote. What we can do, there are initiatives coming from all over the place that are seeking to remove our right to vote, removing names from voting files. Make sure that you are registered. Make sure that your loved ones are registered. Make sure that everything is up to date. Because what is true is that they don't want us to show up. And there are so many different ways for us to vote. And now we know, because many of us did mail-in ballots. I'm still getting ballots sent to me from the county. And so there are ways that you can do this, that even if you got to go to work on election day. But what matters is being present and not being so overcome that you've decided that none of it matters anymore. Because that's easy, and that's privilege. Because many of us could be in a position where, what happens over the next 4 years may not affect us where, monetarily, it may not affect us in our social circles, but it matters that we show up and do what we know to do. But also to remember, this is a moment in time. And with that, we have to be thinking forward. And again, I think of our ancestors often, because if we listen to the Negro spirituals, one thing that is always true in all of them, they're forward thinking. It's always what's on the other side. And that is where I think our minds need to go. It's what's on the other side. And who do we want to be when we get to the other side? Because the other side is coming whether we're ready for it or not. And so we have to provide ourselves with the mentality of who is it that we want to be when we get there, as a people, as individuals, as Americans, and what can we do in the intervening time in this moment to ensure that we arrive at that place the way that we want to. Because that was it. I'm done. Yeah, let's go. Let's wrap this up.
I completely agree with this.
Boom.
That's my 2 cents.
Cosign.
I also say Trump is doing, and they describe it as such, a shock and awe effort. It is designed to destabilize. It's designed to make people feel disoriented. It's designed to feel like everything's coming at you all at once. It is a very smart strategy for someone from his position. But I think Julian is absolutely right? I think if there's any community that is prepared for a moment like this, it is the Black community. It is the Black church community. It is people who have been through these things. It doesn't necessarily mean that your bank account's going to look amazing now that you come from this and you go home and you're like, but the bills still got to get paid, right? Like, that's still true. But I think emotionally and mentally and community is going to be a big thing too. And I think that that's the other thing, is community, like keeping community, maintaining. You don't have to be alone in trying to decipher this and understand this. This is a space to keep with other people and to make sure that, like, I'm simultaneously looking at what's going on in the news, and then I'm watching people doing, where your fans at. Like, I'm like, because we're gonna dance, right? Like, we're gonna have fun. We're gonna have, a good time. We're gonna find the joy there. And I think stealing of joy is partly some of what that shock and awe might feel like it's doing. But I wouldn't let that happen as much. Yeah.
I gotta ask one more question.
It is, sir. Look, is this the one about the tariffs? Yeah, okay.
Is that he is very much a fan of, I think, President William McKinley. And McKinley was known for doing tariffs as an economic policy to improve the economy for the United States. However, obviously the context that McKinley was in when he was doing it was different. And I don't know if that has quite caught up with our current president. But if you're not familiar with the tariff is talked about a lot, right? A tariff is a tax on goods, and they're gonna put it on the people who are sending the goods, like, here, right? So, like, if we're bringing goods from China or bringing goods from Mexico or from Canada, they're like, well, we're gonna tax you for having them come here, right? But the problem is, right, is If I am somebody who is making a good, and now you're telling me that the cost to make that good is gonna go up, so maybe I was charging people $10 for it per item, but now you're gonna charge me a fee, like a tax, and now it's gonna increase the price of me making that good to something higher. Well, more than likely what I would do is, well, I don't want to lose money as the provider of said good, so I would just increase the cost of the item itself. So I can pay for my profits, or I can just make you pay more, right? And so I will charge you $12 or $15 to cover the overhead now of the increased cost of making the good. So this is why people are like, tariffs don't benefit the way we think it is. It will reach to the consumer later. I'm not sure if he has quite a big understanding of that part of it.
If you don't, he's going to get one, because people are going to get real mad, because if we're talking about people who voted for him because the price of eggs was what it is, the idea then that you are dealing with people who, and we're talking Mexico, like just go home and look at all the things that were made in Mexico. Canada, we're talking about aluminum, that means buildings, that means, I know Simone, we're wrapping it up, I'm with you. The idea that it's going to be quick. I don't expect these tariffs to last. I mean, we've already seen the waffling, right? We've already seen him given and taken and given, because he's trying to play a game of chicken, and what I don't think he's prepared for is what happens when Canada and Mexico and China and all these other places call his bluff. And then when the consumer, because it's going to take a while for it to actually to manifest, if it does at all, in our pockets, but all we'll see is that we're spending more money. And if the price of eggs is any indication of what that means for what people are going to do, it suggests to us that, like, this is a problem. And then the question also referenced Wall Street. The problem with that is, one, that's people's retirements. And what we've also seen, right, is that all of these, the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezoses and the Mark Zuckerbergs, they've been losing billions upon billions upon billions. And this, like we said, like the pocketbook is what makes people do stuff.
Yes, we literally call it pocketbook voting.
Right, and so in terms of the voting, in terms of the idea that he's going to be getting a couple calls from some friends saying, you got to knock this out, because the stock market is not going to repair itself if it means that the price of everything is going to increase to do simple things, and it's not inherently bringing jobs back to the United States either, right? And so all of that to say, the tariffs, are probably not going to be very long-lived, because we already see him waffling, and if we get to a point where the consumer begins to really feel the effect of it, every single business is going to say, we have to raise our prices because of the tariffs, because of the Trump administration. So all fingers will be pointing back at him, and if he hates nothing more, it is that.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we give a hand for Dr. Chryl and Dr. Julian Wamble? We know that we didn't get to all the questions because they kept bubbling up, but thank you all so very much. We deeply, deeply appreciate you coming out to share with us and to be with us and to laugh with us and to cry with us. And so as we go through this whole process, we will keep you in mind, but we really appreciate you came out and we're a part of this. All right, thank you so very much. Let's pray. Lord, we want to say thank you. Thank you, Lord God, for bringing this wealth of knowledge